Section 1 of The Crimson Circle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Crimson Circle by Edgar Wallace. Prologue. The Nail. It is a ponderable fact that had not the 29th of a certain September been the anniversary of M. Victor Palleon's birth, there would have been no Crimson Circle mystery. A dozen men, now dead, would in all probability be alive. And Thalia Drummond would certainly never have been described by a dispassionate inspector of police as a thief and the associate of thieves. M. Palleon entertained his 3 assistants to dinner at the Coq d'Or in the city of Toulouse, and the proceedings were both joyous and amiable. At 3 o'clock in the morning it dawned upon M. Palleon that the occasion of his visit to Toulouse was the execution of an English malefactor named Lightman. "My children," he said gravely but unsteadily, "it is 3 hours, and the Red Lady has yet to be assembled." So they adjourned to the place before the prison where a trolley containing the essential parts of the guillotine had been waiting since midnight, and with a skill born of practice they erected the grisly thing, and fitted the knife into its proper slots. But even mechanical skill is not proof against the heady winds of southern France, and when they tried the knife it did not fall truly. "I will arrange this," said M. Palleon, and drove a nail into the frame at exactly the place where a nail should not have been driven. But he was getting flurried, for the soldiers had marched on to the ground. 4 hours later — it was light enough for an enterprising photographer to snap the prisoner close at hand — they marched a man from the prison. "Courage," murmured M. Palleon. "Go to hell," said the victim, now lying strapped upon the plank. M. Palleon pulled a handle and the knife fell as far as the nail. 3 times he tried, and 3 times he failed, and then the indignant spectators broke through the military cordon, and the prisoner was taken back into the jail. 11 years later, that nail killed many people. Chapter 1. The Initiation. It was an hour when most respectable citizens were preparing for bed, and the upper windows of the big old-fashioned houses in the square showed patches of light, against which the outlines of the leafless trees, bending and swaying under the urge of the gale, were silhouetted. A cold wind was sweeping up the river, and its outriders penetrated icily into the remotest and most sheltered places. The man who paced slowly by the high iron railings shivered, though he was warmly clad, for the unknown had chosen a rendezvous which seemed exposed to the full blast of the storm. The debris of the dead autumn whirled in fantastic circles about his feet. The twigs and leaves came rattling down from the trees which threw their long gaunt arms above him, and he looked enviously at the cheerful glow in the windows of a house where, did he but knock, he would be received as a welcome guest. The hour of 11 boomed out from a nearby clock, and the last stroke was reverberating when a car came swiftly and noiselessly into the square and halted abreast of him. The 2 headlamps burned dimly. Within the closed body there was no spark of light. After a moment's hesitation, the waiting man stepped to the car, opened the door and got in. He could only guess the outline of the driver's figure in the seat ahead, and he felt a curious thumping of heart as he realized the terrific importance of the step he had taken. The car did not move, and the man in the driver's seat remained motionless. For a little time there was a dead silence, which was broken by the passenger. "Well?" he asked nervously, almost irritably. "Have you decided?" asked the driver. "Should I be here if I hadn't?" demanded the passenger. "Do you think I've come out of curiosity? What do you want of me? Tell me that, and I will tell you what I want of you." "I know what you want of me," said the driver. His voice was muffled and indistinct, as one who spoke behind a veil. When the newcomer's eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, he detected the vague outline of the black silk cowl which covered the driver's head. "You are on the verge of bankruptcy," the driver went on. "You have used money which was not yours to use, and you are contemplating suicide. And it is not your insolvency which makes you consider this way out. You have an enemy who has discovered something to your discredit, something which would bring you into the hands of the police. 3 days ago you obtained from a firm of manufacturing chemists, a member of which is a friend of yours, a particularly deadly drug which cannot be obtained from a retail chemist. You have spent a week reading up poisons and their effects, and it is your intention, unless something turns up which will save you from ruin, to end your life either on Saturday or Sunday. I think it will be Sunday." He heard the man behind him gasp and laughed softly. "Now, sir," said the driver, "are you prepared for a consideration to act for me?" "What do you want me to do?" demanded the man behind him shakily. "I ask no more than that you should carry out my instructions. I will take care that you run no risks and that you are well paid. I am prepared at this moment to place in your hands a very large sum of money, which will enable you to meet your more pressing obligations. In return for this, I shall want you to put into circulation all the money I send you, to make the necessary exchanges, to cover up the trail of bills and banknotes, the numbers of which are known to the police, to dispose of bonds which I cannot dispose of, and generally to act as my agent." He paused, adding significantly, "and to pay on demand what I ask." The man behind him did not reply for some time, and then he asked with a hint of petulance, "What is the Crimson Circle?" "You," was the startling reply. "I?" gasped the man. "You are of the Crimson Circle," said the other carefully. "You have 100 comrades, none of whom will ever be known to you, none of whom will ever know you." "And you?" "I know them all," said the driver. "You agree?" "I agree," said the other after a pause. The driver half turned in his seat and held out his hand. "Take this," he said. This was a large bulky envelope, and the newly initiated member of the Crimson Circle thrust it into his pocket. "And now get out," said the driver curtly, and the man obeyed without question. He slammed the door behind him and walked abreast of the driver. He was still curious as to his identity, and for his own salvation it was necessary that he should know the man who drove. "Don't light your cigar here," said the driver, "or I shall think that your smoking is really an excuse to strike a match. And remember this, my friend, that the man who knows me carries his knowledge to hell." Before the other could reply, the car moved on, and the man with the envelope stood watching its red tail light until it disappeared from view. He was shaking from head to foot, and when he did light the cigar, which his chattering teeth gripped, the flame of the match quivered tremulously. "That is that," he said huskily, and crossed the road, to disappear in one of the side turnings. He was scarcely out of sight before a figure moved stealthily from the doorway of a dark house, and followed. It was the figure of a man tall and broad, and he walked with difficulty, for he was naturally short of breath. He had gone 100 paces in his pursuit before he realised that he still held in his hand the ship's binoculars through which he had been watching. When he reached the main street his quarry had vanished. He had expected as much and was not perturbed. He knew where to find him. But who was in the car? He had read the number and could trace its owner in the morning, Mr. Felix Marl grinned. Had he so much as guessed the character of the interview he had overlooked, he would not have been amused. Stronger men than he had grown stiff with fear at the menace of the Crimson Circle. Chapter 2. The Man Who Did Not Pay. Philip Bazard paid and lived, for apparently the Crimson Circle kept faith. Jacques Rizzi, the banker, also paid, but in a panic. He died from natural causes a month later, having a weak heart. Benson, the railway lawyer, pooh-poohed the threat and was found dead by the side of his private saloon. Mr. Derrick Yale, with his amazing gifts, ran down the coloured man who had crept into Benson's private car and killed him before he threw the body from the window, and the coloured man was hanged, without, however, revealing the identity of his employer. The police might sneer at Yale's psychometrical powers, as they did, but within 48 hours he had led the police to the criminal's house at Yearside, and the dazed murderer had confessed. Following this tragedy, many men must have paid without reporting the matter to the police, for there was a long period during which no reference to the Crimson Circle found its way into the newspapers. And then, one morning, there came to the breakfast table of James Beardmore a square envelope containing a card, on which was stamped a Crimson Circle. "You are interested in the melodrama of life, Jack. Read that." James Stamford Beardmore tossed the message across the table to his son, and proceeded to open the next letter in the pile, which stood beside his plate. Jack retrieved the message from the floor, where it had fallen, and examined it with a little frown. It was a very ordinary letter card, save that it bore no address. A big circle of crimson touched its four edges, and had the appearance of having been printed with a rubber stamp, for the ink was unevenly distributed. In the centre of the circle, written in printed characters, were the words: 100,000 represents only a small portion of your possessions. You will pay this in notes to a messenger I will send in response to an advertisement in the Tribune within the next 24 hours, stating the exact hour convenient to you. This is the final warning. There was no signature. "Well?" Old Jim Beardmore looked up over his spectacles, and his eyes were smiling. "The Crimson Circle!" gasped his son. Jim Beardmore laughed aloud at the concern in the boy's voice. "Yes, the Crimson Circle. I've had 4 of 'em." The young man stared at him. "4?" he repeated. "Good heavens! Is that why Yale has been staying with us?" Jim Beardmore smiled. "That is a reason," he said. "Of course I knew that he was a detective, but I hadn't the slightest idea—" "Don't worry about this infernal circle," interrupted his father a little impatiently. "I'm not scared of them. Froyant is in terror of his life that he will be marked down, and I don't wonder. He and I have made a few enemies in our time." James Beardmore, with his hard, lined face and his stubbly grey beard, might have been mistaken for the grandfather of the good-looking young man who sat opposite to him. The Beardmore fortune had been painfully won. It had materialised from the wreckage of dreams, and had its beginnings in the privations, the dangers and the heartaches of a prospector's life. This man whom death had stalked on the waterless plains of the Kalahari, who had scraped in the mud of the Veil River for illusory diamonds, and thawed out his claim in the Klondike, had faced too many real dangers to be greatly disturbed by the threat of the Crimson Circle. For the moment his perturbation was based on a more tangible peril, not to himself, but to his son. "I've got a whole lot of faith in your good sense, Jack," he said, "so don't be hurt by anything I'm going to say. I've never interfered in your amusements or questioned your judgment, but do you think that you're being wise just now?" Jack understood. "You mean about Miss Drummond, father?" The older man nodded. "She's Froyant's secretary," began the youth. "I know she is Froyant's secretary," said the other, "and she's none the worse for that. But the point is, Jack, do you know anything more about her?" The young man rolled his napkin deliberately. His face was red, and there was a queer set look about his jaw which secretly amused Jim. "I like her. She's a friend of mine. I've never made love to her, if that is what you mean, Dad, and I rather think our friendship would be at an end if I did." Jim nodded. He had said all that was necessary, and now he took up a more bulky envelope and looked at it curiously. Jack saw that it bore French postage stamps and wondered who was the correspondent. Tearing open the flap, the old man took out a pad of correspondence, which included yet another envelope heavily sealed. He read the superscription, and his nose wrinkled. "Ugh," he said, and put the envelope down unopened. He glanced through the remainder of the correspondence, then looked across at his son. "Never trust a man, or woman, until you know the worst of them," he said. "I've got a man coming to see me today who is a respectable member of society. He has a record as black as my hat, and yet I'm going to do business with him. I know the worst." Jack laughed. Further conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their guest. "Good morning, Yale. Did you sleep well?" asked the old man. "Ring for some more coffee, Jack." Derrick Yale's visit had been an unmixed pleasure to Jack Beardmore. He was at the age when romance had its full appeal, and the companionship of the most commonplace detective would have brought him a peculiar joy. But the glamour which surrounded Yale was the glamour of the supernatural. This man had unusual and peculiar qualities which made him unique. The delicate, aesthetic face, the grave mystery of his eyes, the very gesture of his long, sensitive hands were part of his uniqueness. "I never sleep," he said good-humouredly, as he unrolled his serviette. He held the silver napkin ring for a second between his two fingers, and James Beardmore watched him with amusement. As for Jack, his eager admiration was unconcealed. "Well?" asked the old man. "Who handled this last has had very bad news. Some near relation is desperately ill." Beardmore nodded. "Jane Higgins was the servant who laid the table," he said. "She had a letter this morning saying that her mother was dying." Jack gasped. "And you felt that in the serviette ring?" he asked in amazement. "How do you get that impression, Mr. Yale?" Derrick Yale shook his head. "I don't attempt to explain," he said quietly. "All that I know is that the moment I took up my serviette I had a sensation of profound and poignant sorrow. It is weird, isn't it?" "But how did you know about her mother?" "I traced it somehow," said the other almost brusquely. "It is a matter of deduction. Have you any news, Mr. Beardmore?" For answer Jim handed him the card he had received that morning. Yale read the message, then weighed the card on the palm of his white hand. "Posted by a sailor," he said. "A man who has been in prison and has recently lost a great deal of money." Jim Beardmore laughed. "Which I shall certainly not replace," he said, rising from the table. "Do you take these warnings seriously?" "I take them very seriously," said Derrick in his quiet way. "So seriously that I do not advise you to leave this house except in my company. The Crimson Circle," he went on, arresting Beardmore's indignant protest with a characteristic gesture, "is, I admit, vulgarly melodramatic in its operations, but it will be no solace to your heirs to learn that you have died theatrically." Jim Beardmore was silent for a time, and his son regarded him anxiously. "Why don't you go abroad, father?" he asked, and the old man snapped round on him. "Go abroad be damned!" he roared. "Run away from a cheap Black Hand gang? I'll see them—" He did not mention their destination, but they could guess. End of section 1. Section 2 of The Crimson Circle by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 3. The Girl Who Was Indifferent. A heavy weight lay on Jack Beardmore's mind as he walked slowly across the meadows that morning. His feet carried him instinctively in the direction of the little valley which lay a mile from the house, and in the exact centre of which ran the hedge which marked the division between the Beardmore and Froyant estates. It was a glorious morning. The storm of wind and rain which had swept the country the night before had blown itself out, and the world lay bathed in yellow sunlight. Far away, beyond the olive-green commons that crowned Penton Hill, he caught a glimpse of Harvey Froyant's big white mansion. Would she venture out, with the ground so sodden and the grasses soaked with rain, he wondered. He stopped by a big elm tree on the lip of the valley, and cast an anxious glance along the untidy hedge, until his eyes rested on a tiny summer house which the former owners of Tower House had erected. Harvey Froyant, who loathed solitude, would never have been guilty of such extravagance. There was nobody in sight, and his heart sank. 10 minutes' walking brought him to the gap he had made in the fence, and he stepped through. The girl who sat in the tiny house might have heard his sigh of relief. She looked round, then rose with some evidence of reluctance. She was remarkably pretty, with her fair hair and flawless skin, but there was no welcome in her eyes as she came slowly toward him. "Good morning," she said coolly. "Good morning, Thalia," he ventured, and her frown returned. "I wish you wouldn't," she said, and he knew that she meant what she said. Her attitude toward him puzzled and worried him, for she was a thing of laughter and bubbling life. He had once surprised her chasing a hare, and had watched, spellbound, the figure of this laughing Diana as her little feet flew across the field in pursuit of the scared beast. He had heard her singing too, and the very joy of life was vibrant in her voice, but he had seen her so depressed and gloomy that he had feared she was ill. "Why are you always so stiff and formal with me?" he grumbled. For a second a ghost of a smile showed at the corner of her mouth. "Because I've read books," she said solemnly, "and poor girl secretaries who aren't stiff and formal with millionaires' sons usually come to a bad end." She had a trick of directness which was very disconcerting. "Besides," she said, "there is no reason why I shouldn't be stiff and formal. It is the conventional attitude which people adopt toward their fellow creatures, unless they are very fond of them, and I'm not very fond of you." She said this calmly and deliberately, and the young man's face went red. He felt a fool and cursed himself for provoking this act of cruelty. "I will tell you something, Mr. Beardmore," she went on in her even tone. "Something which you haven't realised. When a boy and girl are thrown together on a desert island, it is only natural that the boy gets the idea that the girl is the only girl in the world. All his wayward fancies are concentrated on one woman, and as the days pass she grows more and more wonderful in his eyes. I've read a lot of these desert island stories, and I've seen a lot of pictures that deal with that interesting situation, and that is how it strikes me. You are on a desert island here. You spend too much time on your estate, and the only things you see are rabbits and birds and Thalia Drummond. You should go into the city and into the society of people of your own station." She turned from him with a nod, for she had seen her employer approaching, had watched him out of the corner of her eye as he stopped to survey them, and had guessed his annoyance. "I thought you were doing the house accounts, Miss Drummond," he said with asperity. He was a skinny man in the early 50s, colourless, sharp-featured, prematurely bald. He had an unpleasant habit of baring his long yellow teeth when he asked a question, a grimace which in some curious way suggested his belief that the answer would be an evasion. "Morning, Beardmore." He jerked the salutation grudgingly, and turned again to his secretary. "I don't like to see you wasting your time, Miss Drummond," he said. "I am not wasting either your time or mine, Mr. Froyant," she answered calmly. "I have finished the accounts. Here." She tapped the worn leather portfolio which was under her arm. "You could have done the work in my library," he complained. "There is no need to go into the wilderness." He stopped and rubbed his long nose, and glanced from the girl to the silent young man. "Very good, that will do," he said. I'm going to see your father, Beardmore. Perhaps you'll walk with me." Delia was already on her way to Tower House, and Jack had no excuse for lingering. "Don't occupy that girl's time, Beardmore, don't, please," said Froyant testily. "You've no idea how much she has to do, and I'm sure your father wouldn't like it." Jack was on the point of saying something offensive, but checked himself. He loathed Harvey Froyant, and at the moment hated him for his domineering attitude toward the girl. "That class of girl," began Mr. Froyant, turning to walk by the side of the hedge toward the gate at the end of the valley. "That class of girl—" He stood still and stared. "Who the devil has broken through the hedge?" he demanded, pointing with his stick. "I did," said Jack savagely. "It's our hedge anyway, and it saves half a mile. Come on, Mr. Froyant." Harvey Froyant made no comment as he stepped gingerly through the hedge. They walked slowly up the hill toward the big elm tree where Jack had stood looking down into the valley. Mr. Harvey Froyant preserved a tight-lipped silence. He was a stickler for the conventions, where their observations benefited himself. They had reached the crest of the rise when suddenly his arm was gripped, and he turned to see Jack Beardmore staring at the bole of the tree. Froyant followed the direction of his eye and took a step backward, his unhealthy face a shade paler. Painted on the tree trunk was a rough circle of crimson, and the paint was yet wet. Chapter 4. Mr. Felix Marl. Jack Beardmore looked round, scanning the country. The only human being in sight was a man who was walking slowly away from them, carrying a bag in his hand. Jack shouted, and the man turned. "Who are you?" demanded Jack. Then, "What are you doing here?" The stranger was a tall, stoutish man, and the exertion of carrying his grip had left him a little breathless. It was some time before he could reply. "My name is Marl," he said. "Felix Marl. You may have heard of me. I think you are young Mr. Beardmore, aren't you?" "That is my name," said Jack. "What are you doing here?" he asked again. "They told me there was a short cut from the railway station, but it is not so short as they promised," said Mr. Marl, breathing stertorously. "I'm on my way to see your father." "Have you been near that tree?" asked Jack, and Marl glared at him. "Why should I go near any tree?" he demanded aggressively. "I tell you I've come straight across the fields." By this time Harvey Froyant arrived, and apparently recognised the newcomer. "This is Mr. Marl, I know him. Marl, did you see anybody near that tree?" The man shook his head. Apparently the tree and its secret was a mystery to him. "I never knew there was a tree there," he said. What has happened?" "Nothing," said Harvey Froyant sharply. They came to the house soon after, Jack carrying the visitor's bag. He was not impressed by the big man's appearance. His voice was coarse, his manner familiar, and Jack wondered what association this uncouth specimen of humanity could have with his father. They were nearing the house when suddenly, and for no obvious reason, the stout Mr. Marl emitted a frightened squeal and leapt back. There was no doubt of his fear. It was written visibly in the blanched cheeks and the quivering lips of the man, who was shaking from head to foot. Jack could only look at him in astonishment, and even Harvey Froyant was startled into an interest. "What the hell's wrong with you, Marl?" he asked savagely. His own nerves were on edge, and the sight of the big man's undisguised terror was a further strain which he could scarcely endure. Nothing," muttered Marl huskily. "I've been—" "Drinking, I should think," snapped Froyant. After seeing the man into the house, Jack hurried off in search of Derrick Yale. He discovered the detective in the shrubbery sitting in a big cane chair, his chin upon his breast, his arms folded, a characteristic attitude of his. Yale looked up at the sound of the young man's footsteps. "I can't tell you," he said, before Jack had framed his question, and then, seeing the look of astonishment on his face, he laughed. "You were going to ask me what scared Marl, weren't you?" "I came with that intention," laughed Jack. What an extraordinary fellow you are, Mr. Yale. Did you see his extraordinary exhibition of funk?" Derrick Yale nodded. "I saw him just before he had his shock," he said. "You can see the field path from here." He frowned. "He reminds me of somebody," he said slowly, "yet I cannot for the life of me tell who it is. Is he a frequent visitor here? Your father told me he was coming, and I guessed it was he." Jack shook his head. "This is the first time I've seen him," he said. "I remember now, though, that father and Froyant have had some business dealings with a man named Marl. Dad mentioned him one day. I think he's a land speculator. Father is rather interested in land just now. By the way, I've seen the mark of the Crimson Circle," he added, and described the newly painted O he had found on the elm. Instantly Yale lost interest in Mr. Marl. "It was not on the tree when I went down into the valley," said Jack. "I'll swear to that. It must have been painted whilst I was talking to a friend. The trunk is out of sight from the boundary fence, and it was quite possible for somebody to have painted the sign without being seen. What does it mean, Mr. Yale?" "It means trouble," said Yale shortly. He rose abruptly and began pacing the flagged walk, and Jack, after waiting a little while, left him to his meditations. In the meantime, Mr. Felix Marl was comparatively a useless third of a conference which dealt with the transfer of lands. Marl was, as Jack had said, a land speculator, and he had come that morning bringing a promising proposition which he was wholly incapable of explaining. "I can't help it, gentlemen," he said, and for the fourth time his trembling hand rose to his lips. "I've had a bit of a shock this morning." "What was that?" But Marl seemed incapable of explanation. He could only shake his head helplessly. "I'm not fit to discuss things calmly," he said. "We'll have to put the matter off until tomorrow." "Do you think I've come here to day for the purpose of listening to that sort of nonsense?" snarled Mr. Froyant. "I tell you I want this business settled. So do you, Beardmore." Jim Beardmore, who was indifferent as to whether the matter was settled then or the following week, laughed. "I don't know that it is very important," he said. "If Mr. Marl is upset, why should we bother him? Perhaps you'll stay here tonight, Marl." "No, no, no!" The man's voice rose almost to a shout. "No, I won't stay here if you don't mind. I would much rather not." "Just as you like," said Jim Beardmore indifferently, and folded up the papers he had prepared for signature. They walked out into the hall together, and there Jack found them. Beardmore's car carried the visitor and his bag back to the station, and from there on Mr. Marl's conduct was peculiar. He registered his bag through to the city, but he himself descended at the next station, and for a man who so disliked walking, and as by nature so averse from physical exercise, he displayed an almost heroic spirit, for he set forth to walk the 9 miles which separated him from the Beardmore estate, and he did not go by the shortest route. It was nearing nightfall when Mr. Marl made his furtive way into a thick plantation on the edge of the Beardmore property. He sat down, a tired, dusty, but determined man, and waited for the night to close down over the countryside. And during the period of waiting he examined with tender care the heavy automatic pistol he had taken from his bag in the train. Chapter 5. The Girl Who Ran. "I can't understand why that fellow hasn't come back this morning," said Jim Beardmore with a frown. "Which fellow?" asked Jack carelessly. "I'm speaking of Marl," said his father. "Was that the large-sized gentleman I saw yesterday?" asked Derrick Yale. They were standing on the terrace of the house, which, from its elevated position, gave them a view across the country. The morning train had come and gone. They could see the trail of white smoke it left as it disappeared into the foothills 9 miles away. "Yes, I'd better phone Froyant and tell him not to come over." Jim Beardmore stroked his stubbly chin. "Marl puzzles me," he said. "He's a brilliant fellow, I believe, a reformed thief, I know. At least, I hope he is reformed. What upset him yesterday, Jack? He came into the library looking like death." "I haven't the slightest idea," said Jack. "I think he has a weak heart, or something of the sort. He told me he gets these spasms occasionally." Beardmore laughed softly, and going into the house, returned with a walking stick. "I'm going for a stroll, Jack. No, you needn't come along. I've one or two things I wish to think out, and I promise you, Yale, I won't leave the grounds, though I think you attach too much importance to the threats of these ruffians." Yale shook his head. "What of the sign on the tree?" he asked. Jim Beardmore snorted contemptuously. "It will take more than that to extract 100,000 from me," he said. He waved a farewell at them as he went down the broad stone steps, and they watched him walking slowly across the park. "Do you really think my father is in any kind of danger?" asked Jack. Yale, who had been staring after the figure, turned with a start. "In danger?" he repeated, and then, after a second's hesitation, "Yes, I believe there is very serious danger for him in the next day or two." Jack turned his troubled gaze upon the disappearing figure. "I hope you're wrong," he said. "Father doesn't seem to take the matter as seriously as you." "That is because your father has not the same experience," said the detective. "But I understand that he saw Chief Inspector Parr, and the inspector thought there was considerable danger." Jack chuckled in spite of his fears. "How do the lion and the lamb amalgamate?" he asked. "I didn't think that headquarters had much use for private men like you, Mr. Yale." "I admire Parr," said Derrick slowly. "He's slow but thorough. I am told that he is one of the most conscientious men at headquarters, and I fancy that the headquarters chiefs have treated him badly over the last Crimson Circle crime. They've practically told him that if he cannot run the organisation to earth, he must send in his resignation." Whilst they were speaking, the figure of Mr. Beardmore had disappeared into the gloom of a little wood on the edge of the estate. "I worked with him during the last Circle murder," Derrick Yale went on, "and he struck me—" He stopped, and the two men looked at one another. There was no mistaking the sound. It was a shot near and distinct, and it came from the direction of the wood. In an instant Jack had leapt over the balustrade and was racing across the meadow, Derrick Yale behind him. 20 paces along the woodland path they found Jim Beardmore lying on his face, and he was quite dead. And even as Jack was staring down at his father with horrified eyes, a girl emerged from the wood at the farther end, and stopped only long enough to wipe with a handful of grass something that was red from her hands, and she flew along the shadow of the hedge which divided the Froyant estate. Never once did Thalia Drummond look back until she reached the shelter of the little summer house. Her face was drawn and white, and her breath came gaspingly as she stood for a second in the doorway of the little hut and looked back to the wood. A swift glance round and she was in the house and on her knees, tugging with quivering hands at the end of a floor board. It came up, disclosing a black cavity. Another second's hesitation, and she threw into the hole the revolver she had held in her hand, and dropped the board back in its place. End of section 2. Section 3 of The Crimson Circle by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 6. Thalia Drummond is a crook. The Commissioner looked down at the newspaper cutting before him and tugged at his grey moustache. Inspector Parr, who knew the signs, watched with an apparently detached interest. He was a short, thick-set man, so lacking in inches that it was remarkable that he had ever satisfied the stringent requirements of the police authorities. His age was something below 50, but his big red face was unlined. It was a face from whence every indication of intelligence and refinement was absent. The round, staring eyes were bovine in their lack of expression. The big, fleshy nose, the heavy cheeks, pouched beneath the jaws, and the half-bald head were units of his unimpressiveness. The Commissioner picked up the cutting. "Listen to this," he said curtly, and read. It was the editorial of the Morning Monitor, and it was direct to a point of offensiveness. "For the second time during the past year, the country has been shocked and outraged by the assassination of a prominent man. It is not necessary to give here the details of this Crimson Circle crime, particulars of which appear on another page, but it is very necessary that we should state in emphatic and unmistakable terms that we view with consternation the seeming helplessness of police headquarters to deal with this criminal gang. Inspector Parr, who has devoted himself for the past year to tracking the murdering blackmailers, can offer us nothing more than vague promises of revelations which never materialize. It is obvious that police headquarters needs a thorough overhauling and the introduction of new blood, and we trust that those responsible for the government of the country will not hesitate to make the drastic changes which are necessary." "Well," growled Colonel Morton, "what do you think of that, Parr?" Mr. Parr rubbed his big chin and said nothing. "James Beardmore was murdered after due warning had been given to the police," said the Commissioner deliberately. "He was shot within sight of his house, and the murderer is at large. This is the second bad case, Parr, and I'll tell you candidly that it is my intention to act on the advice which this newspaper gives." He tapped the cutting suggestively. "On the previous occasion you allowed Mr. Yale to get away with all the kudos for the capture of the murderer. You have seen Mr. Yale, I presume?" The detective nodded. "And what does he say?" Mr. Parr shifted uneasily on his feet. "He told me a lot of nonsense about a dark man with toothache." "How did he get that?" asked the Commissioner quickly. "From the shell of the cartridge he found on the ground," said the detective. "I don't take any notice of this psychometrical stuff." The Commissioner leant back in his chair and sighed. "I don't think you take notice of any stuff that is serviceable, Parr," he said. "And don't sneer at Yale. That man has unusual and peculiar gifts. The fact that you don't understand them does not make them any less peculiar." "Do you mean to say, sir," said Parr, stirred into protest, "that a man can take a cartridge in his hand and tell you from that the appearance of the person who last handled it and what he was thinking about? Why, it's absurd." "Nothing is absurd," said the Commissioner quietly. "The science of psychometry has been practised for years. Some people, unusually sensitive to impression, are able to tell the most remarkable things, and Yale is one of these." "He was there when the murder was committed," replied Parr. "He was with Mr. Beardmore's son, not 100 yards away, and yet he did not catch the murderer." The Commissioner nodded. "Neither have you," he said. 12 months ago you told me of your scheme for trapping the Crimson Circle, and I agreed. We've both expected a little too much for your plan, I think. You must try something else. I hate to say it, but there it is." Parr did not answer for a time, and then, to the Commissioner's surprise, he pulled up a chair to the desk and sat down uninvited. "Colonel," he said, "I'm going to tell you something." And he was so earnest, so unlike his usual self, that the Commissioner could only look at him in amazement. "The Crimson Circle gang is easy to get. I can find every one of them, and will find them if you will give me time, but it's the hub of the wheel that I'm after. If I can get the hub, the spokes don't count, but you've got to give me a little more authority than I have at present." "A little more authority?" said the dumbfounded Commissioner. "What the devil do you mean?" "I'll explain," said the bovine Mr. Parr, and he explained to such purpose that he left the Commissioner a very silent and a very thoughtful man. After he left headquarters, Mr. Parr's first call was at an office in the centre of the city. On the 3rd floor, in a tiny suite, which was distinguished only by the name of the occupant, Mr. Derrick Yale was waiting for him, and a greater contrast between the two men could not be imagined. Yale, the overstrung, nervous and sensitive dreamer; Parr, solid and beefy, seemingly incapable of an independent thought. "How did your interview go on, Parr?" "Not very well," said Parr ruefully. "I think the Commissioner's got one against me. Have you discovered anything?" "I've discovered your man with the toothache," was the astonishing reply. "His name is Sibley. He's a seafaring man, and was seen in the vicinity of the house the following day. Yesterday," he picked up a telegram, "he was arrested for drunken and disorderly conduct, and in his possession was found an automatic pistol, which I should imagine was the weapon with which the crime was committed. You remember that the bullet which was extracted from poor Beardmore was obviously fired from an automatic." Parr gaped at him in amazement. "How did you find this out?" And Derrick Yale laughed softly. "You haven't a great deal of faith in my deductions," he said with a glint of humour in his eyes. "But when I felt that cartridge I was as certain that I could see the man as I am certain I can see you. I sent one of my own staff down to make inquiries, with this result." He picked up the telegram. Mr. Parr stood, a heavy frown disfiguring what little claim to beauty he might have. "So they've caught him," he said softly. "Now I wonder if he wrote this." He took out a pocket-book, and Derrick Yale saw him extract a scrap of paper which had evidently been burned, for the edges were black. Yale took the scrap from his hand. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "I raked it out of the ashpan at Beardmore's place yesterday," he said. The writing was in a large scrawling hand, and the scrap ran: "You alone, me alone, Block B graft." "Me alone, you alone," read Yale. "Block B graft?" He shook his head. "It's Greek to me." He balanced the letter upon the palm of his hand and shook his head. "I can't even feel an impression," he said. "Fire destroys the aura." Parr carefully put away the scrap into his case and replaced it in his pocket. "There's another thing I'd like to tell you," he said. "Somebody was in the wood who wore pointed shoes and smoked cigars. I found the cigar ashes in a little hollow, and his footprint was on the flower beds." "Near the house?" asked Derrick Yale, startled. The solid man nodded. "My own theory is," he went on, "that somebody wanted to warn Beardmore, wrote this letter and brought it to the house after dark. It must have been received by the old man, because he burnt it. I found the ashes in the place where the servants dumped their cinders." There was a gentle tap at the door. "Jack Beardmore," said Yale under his breath. Jack Beardmore showed signs of the distressing period through which he had passed. He nodded to Parr and came toward Yale with outstretched hand. "No news, I suppose?" he asked, and turning to the other, "You were at the house yesterday, Mr. Parr. Did you find anything?" "Nothing worth speaking about," said Parr. "I've just been to see Froyant. He's in town," said Jack. "It wasn't a very successful visit, for he's in a pitiable state of nerves." He did not explain that the unsatisfactory part of his call was that he had not seen Thalia Drummond, and only one of the men guessed the reason of his disappointment. Derrick Yale told him of the arrest which had been made. "I don't want you to build any hopes on this," he said. "Even if he is the man who fired the shot, he is certain to be no more than the agent. We shall probably hear the same story as we heard before, that he was in low water and that the chief of the Crimson Circle induced him to commit the act. We're as far from the real solution as ever we've been." They strolled out of the office together into the clean autumn sunlight. Jack, who had an engagement with a lawyer who was settling his father's estate, accompanied the two men, who were on their way to catch a train for the town where the suspected murderer was detained. They were passing through one of the busiest streets when Jack uttered an exclamation. On the opposite side of the road was a big pawnbroker's, and a girl was coming from the side entrance devoted to the service of those who needed temporary loans. "Well, I'm blessed!" It was Parr's unemotional voice. "I haven't seen her for 2 years." Jack turned on him open-eyed. "Haven't seen her for 2 years?" he said slowly. "Are you referring To that lady?" Parr nodded. "I'm referring to Thalia Drummond," he said calmly, "who is a crook and a companion of crooks." Chapter 7 The Stolen Idol Jack heard him and was stunned. He stood motionless and speechless as the girl, as though unconscious of the scrutiny, hailed a taxi cab and was driven away. "Now what the dickens was she doing there?" said Parr. "A crook and a companion of crooks," repeated Jack mechanically. "Good God, where are you going?" he asked quickly, as the inspector took a step into the roadway. "I intend discovering what she has been doing in the pawnbroker's," said the stolid Parr. "She may have gone there because she was short of money. It is no crime to be short of money." Jack realised the feebleness of his defence even as he spoke. Thalia Drummond a thief! It was incredible, impossible. And yet he followed unresistingly the detective as he crossed the road, followed him down the dark passage to the loaning department, and was present in the manager's room when an assistant brought in the article which the girl had pledged. It was a small golden figure of Buddha. "I thought it was queer," said the manager, when Parr had made himself known. "She only wanted £10, and it's worth 100 if it's worth a penny." "What explanation did she give?" asked Derrick Yale, who had been a silent listener. "She said she was short of money, and that her father had a number of these curios, but wanted to pledge them at a price which would allow him to redeem them." "Did she leave her address? What name did she give?" "Thalia Drummond," said the assistant, "of 29 Park Gate." Derrick Yale uttered an exclamation. "Why, that's Froyant's address, isn't it?" Too well Jack knew it was the address of the miserly Harvey Froyant, and he remembered with a sinking of heart that Froyant made a hobby of collecting these Eastern antiquities. The inspector gave a receipt for the idol and slipped it into his pocket. "We'll go along and see Mr. Froyant," he said, and Jack interposed desperately. "For heaven's sake, don't let us get this girl into trouble," he pleaded. "It may have been some sudden temptation. I will make things right if money can settle the affair." Derrick Yale was eyeing the young man with a grave, understanding look. "You know Miss Drummond?" Jack nodded. He was too miserable to speak. He felt an absurd desire to run away and hide himself. "It can't be done," said Inspector Parr definitely. He was the conventional police officer now. "I'm going along to Froyant's to discover whether this article was pledged with his approval." "Then you'll go by yourself," said Jack wrathfully. He could not contemplate being a witness of the girl's humiliation. It was monstrous. It was beastly of Parr, he said to Yale when they were alone. The girl would not commit so mean a theft, the stupid blundering fool. I wish to heaven I'd never called his attention to her. "It was he who saw her first," said Yale, and dropped his hand upon the young man's shoulder. "Jack, you're a little unstrung, I think. Why are you so interested in Miss Drummond? Of course," he said suddenly, "you must have seen a lot of her when you were at home. Froyant's estate joins yours, doesn't it?" Jack nodded. "If he would give as much attention to the running down of the Crimson Circle as he gives to the hounding of that poor girl," he said bitterly, "my poor father would be alive to day." Derrick Yale did his best to soothe him. He took him back to his office and tried to bring his thoughts to a more pleasant channel. They had been there a quarter of an hour when the telephone bell rang. It was Parr who spoke. "Well?" asked Yale. "I've arrested Thalia Drummond and I'm charging her in the morning," was the laconic message. Yale put down the receiver gently and turned to the young man. "She's arrested?" Jack guessed before he spoke. Yale nodded. Jack Beardmore's face was very white. "You see, Jack," said Yale gently, "you have probably been as much deceived as Froyant. The girl's a thief." "If she were a thief and murderess," said Jack doggedly, "I love her." Chapter 8 The Charge Mr. Parr's interview with Harvey Froyant was a short one. At the sight of the detective, That thin man blanched. He knew him by sight and had met him in connection with the Beardmore tragedy. "Well, well," he asked tremulously. "What is wrong? Have these infernal people started a new campaign?" "Nothing so bad as that, sir," said Parr. "I came to ask you a few questions. How long have you had Thalia Drummond in your house?" "She's been my secretary for 3 months," said Froyant suspiciously. "Why?" "What wages do you pay her?" asked Parr. Mr. Froyant mentioned a sum grossly inadequate, and even he was apologetic for its inefficiency. "I give her food, you know, and she has evenings off," he said, feeling that the starvation wage must be justified. "Has she been short of money lately?" Mr. Froyant stared at him. "Why, yes. She asked me if I could advance her £5 yesterday," he said. "She said she had a call upon her purse which she could not meet. Of course I didn't advance the money. I do not approve of advancing money for work which is not performed," said Froyant virtuously. "It tends to pauperise." "You have a large number of antiques, I understand, Mr. Froyant, some of them very valuable. Have you missed any lately?" Froyant jumped to his feet. The very hint that he might have been robbed was sufficient to set his mind in a panic. Without a word he rushed from the room. He was gone 3 minutes, and when he came back his eyes were almost bulging from his head. "My Buddha!" he gasped. "It's worth £100. It was there this morning." "Send for Miss Drummond," said the detective briefly. Thalia came, a cool, self-possessed girl, who stood by her employer's desk, her hands clasped behind her, scarcely looking at the detective. The interview was short, and for Mr. Froyant, painful. Upon the girl it had no apparent effect whatever. And yet she must have known, from the steely glare in Froyant's eyes, that her theft had been detected. For a little time the man found a difficulty in framing a coherent sentence. "You've stolen something of mine," he blurted out. His voice was almost a squeak. The accusing hand trembled in the intensity of his emotion. "You're a thief." "I asked you for the money," said the girl coolly. "If you hadn't been such a wicked old skinflint, you'd have let me have it." You spluttered Froyant, and then with a gasp, "I charge her, Inspector, I charge her with theft. You shall go to prison for this. Mark my words, young woman. Wait, wait." He raised his hand. "I will see if anything else is missing." "You can save yourself the trouble," said the girl, as he was leaving the room. "The Buddha was the only thing I took, and it was an ugly little beast anyway." "Give me your keys," stormed the enraged man. "To think that I've allowed you to open my business letters." "I've opened one which will not be pleasant for you, Mr. Froyant," she said quietly, and then he saw what she was holding in her hand. She passed the envelope across to him, and with staring eyes he saw the Crimson Circle. But the words written within the hoop were blurred and indistinct. He dropped the card and collapsed into a chair. End of section 3. Section 4 of The Crimson Circle by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 9. Thalia in the Police Court. The magistrate was a kind-hearted man and seemed uncomfortable. He looked from the unemotional Mr. Parr, who stood on the witness stand, to the girl in the steel pen, and she was almost as cool and as self-controlled as the police witness. Her face was one which would have attracted attention in any circumstances, but in the drab setting of the police court her beauty was emphasised and enhanced. The magistrate glanced down at the charge sheet before him. Her age was described as 21, her occupation as secretary. The man of law, who had had many shocks in his lifetime and had steeled himself to the most unusual and improbable happenings, could only shake his head in despair. "Is anything known against this woman?" he asked, and felt it was absurd even to refer to the slim, girlish prisoner as a woman. "She has been under observation for some time, your worship," was the reply. "But she has not been in the hands of the police before." The magistrate looked over his glasses at the girl. "I cannot understand how you got yourself into this terrible position," he said. "A girl who has evidently had the education of a lady. You've been charged with the theft of a few pounds, for although the article you stole was worth a large sum, that was all that your dishonesty realised. Your act was probably due to some great temptation. I suppose the need for the money was very urgent, yet that does not excuse your act. I shall bind you over to come up for judgment when called upon, treating you as a first offender, and I do most earnestly appeal to you to live honestly and avoid a repetition of this unpleasant experience." The girl bowed slightly and left the box for the police office, and the next case was called. Harvey Froyant rose at the same time and made his way out of the court. He was a rich man to whom money represented the goal and object of life. He was the type of man who counted the contents of his pocket every night before he went to bed, and he would have had his own mother arrested in similar circumstances. Thalia Drummond's offence was made more hideous in his eyes because her last act of service had been to hand to him the warning of the Crimson Circle, from the shock of which he had not yet recovered. He was a large thin man with a permanent stoop. His attitude towards the world was one of acute suspicion. For the moment it was one of resentment, for he held the strongest views on the sacredness of property. To Parr, who followed him out of the court, he expressed his disappointment that the girl had not been sent to prison. "A woman like that is a danger to society," he complained in his high-pitched, peevish voice. "How do I know that she isn't in league with these blackguards who are threatening me? 40,000 they ask for, 40,000!" He wailed the last words. "It's your duty to see that I come to no harm. Understand that. It is your duty." "I heard you," said Inspector Parr wearily. "And as to the girl, I don't suppose she ever heard of the Crimson Circle. She's very young." "Young!" snarled the lean man. "That's the time to punish them, isn't it? Catch them young and punish them young, and you may turn them into respectable citizens." "I daresay you're right," agreed the stout Mr. Parr with a sigh, and then inconsequently, "children are a great responsibility." Froyant muttered something under his breath, and without so much as a nod of farewell, walked rapidly through the court, into the motor car which was waiting for him at the entrance to the court house. The inspector watched him depart with a slow smile, and, looking round, caught the eye of a young man who was waiting by the clerk's door. "Good morning, Mr. Beardmore," he said. "Are you waiting to see the young lady?" "Yes. How long will they keep her?" asked Jack nervously. Mr. Parr gazed at him with expressionless eyes, and sniffed. "If you don't mind my saying so, Mr. Beardmore," he said quietly, "you are probably taking a greater interest in Miss Drummond than is good for you." "What do you mean?" asked Jack quietly. "The whole thing was a plot. That beast Froyant." The inspector shook his head. "Miss Drummond admitted that she took the statuette," he said, "and besides, we saw her coming out of Isaac's. There isn't any doubt about it." "She only made the admission for some reason best known to herself," said Jack violently. "Do you think a girl like that would steal? Why should she? I would have given her anything she wanted." He checked himself suddenly. "There's something behind this," he went on more quietly. "Something which I do not understand, and probably you do not understand either, Inspector." The door opened at that moment and the girl came out. She stopped at the sight of Jack, and a faint flush crept into her pale face. "Were you in court?" she asked quickly. He nodded, and she shook her head. "You shouldn't have come," she said almost vehemently. "How did you know? Who told you?" She seemed oblivious to the presence of the inspector, but for the first time since her arrest she showed some sign of her pent emotion. The colour came and went, and her voice shook a little as she continued: "I'm sorry you knew anything about it, Mr. Beardmore, and I'm desperately sorry you came," she said. "But it isn't true," he interrupted. You can tell me that, Delia. It was a plot, wasn't it? A plot intended to ruin you." His voice was almost pleading, but she shook her head. "There was no plot," she said quietly. "I stole from Mr. Froyant." "But why? Why?" he asked despairingly. "Why did you—" "I'm afraid I can't tell you why," she said with the ghost of a smile on her lips, "except that I needed the money, and that is good and sufficient reason, isn't it?" "I'll never believe it." Jack's face was set, and his grey eyes regarded her steadily. "You are not the kind who would indulge in petty pilfering." She looked at him for a long time, and then turned her eyes to the inspector. "You may be able to undeceive Mr. Beardmore," she said. "I am afraid I cannot." "Where are you going?" he asked, as, with a little nod, she was passing on. "I am going home," she replied. "Please don't come with me, Mr. Beardmore." "But you have no home." "I've a lodging," she said with a hint of impatience. "Then I'm going with you," he said doggedly. She did not make any remonstrance, and they passed from the court together into the busy street. No word was spoken until they reached the entrance of a tube station. "Now I must go home," she said more gently than before. "But what are you going to do?" he demanded. "How are you going to get your living with this terrible charge against you?" "Is it so terrible?" she asked coolly. She was walking into the station entrance when he took her arm and swung her round with almost savage violence. "Now listen to me, Thalia," he said between his teeth. "I love you and I want to marry you. I haven't told you that before, but you've guessed it. I'm not going to allow you to go out of my life. Do you understand that? I do not believe that you are a thief and—" Very gently she disengaged his grip. "Mr. Beardmore," she said in a low voice, "you are just being quixotic and foolish. You've told me what you will not allow, and I tell you that I'm not going to allow you to ruin your life through your infatuation for a convicted thief. You know nothing of me except that I am a seemingly nice girl whom you met by accident in the country, and it is my duty to be your mother and your maiden aunt." There was a glint of amusement in her eye as she took his offered hand. "Some day perhaps we shall meet again, and by that time the glamour of romance will have worn off. Good bye." She had disappeared into the booking hall before he could find his voice. Chapter 10 The Summons of the Crimson Circle. Thalia Drummond went back to the lodging she had occupied before she had entered Mr. Harvey Froyant's service as resident secretary, and apparently the story of her ill deeds had preceded her, for the stout landlady gave her a chilly welcome, and had she not continued to pay the rent for her one room during the time she was working for Froyant, it was probable that she would not have been admitted. It was a small room, neatly if plainly furnished, and oblivious to the landlady's glum face and cold reception, she went to her apartment and locked the door behind her. She had spent a very unpleasant week, for she had been remanded in custody, and her very clothes seemed to exhale the musty odour of Holloway Gaol. Holloway, however, had an advantage which No. 14 Lexington Street did not possess. It had an admirable system of bathrooms, for which the girl was truly grateful as she began to change. She had plenty to occupy her mind. Harvey Froyant, Jack Beardmore. She frowned as though at a distasteful thought, and tried to dismiss him from her mind. It was a relief to go back to Froyant. She almost hated him. She certainly despised him. The time she had spent in his house had been the most wretched period in her life. She had taken her meals with the servants, and had been conscious that every scrap of food she ate had been measured and weighed and duly apportioned by a man whose cheque for 7 figures would have been honoured. "At least he didn't make love to you, my dear," she said to herself, and smiled. Somehow she couldn't imagine Harvey Froyant making love to anybody. She recalled the days she had followed him about his big house with a notebook in her hand, whilst he searched for evidence of his servants' neglect, drawing his fingers along the polished shelves in the library in a vain search for dust, turning up carpet corners, examining silver, or else counting, as he did regularly every week, the contents of his still room. He measured the wine at table and counted the empty bottles, even the corks. It was his boast that in his big garden he could tell the absence of a flower. These he sent to market regularly, with the vegetables he grew and the peaches which ripened on the wall, and woe betide the unlucky gardener who had poached so much as a ripe apple from the orchard, for Harvey had an uncanny instinct which led him to the rifled tree. She smiled a little wryly at the recollection, and, having completed her change of costume, she went out, locking the door behind her. Her landlady watched her pass down the street and nodded ominously. "Your lodger's come back," said a neighbour. "Yeah, she's come back," said the woman grimly. "A nice lady she is, I don't think. It's the first time I've ever had a crook in my house, and it'll be the last. I'm giving her notice tonight." Unconscious of the criticism, Thalia boarded a bus which took her into the city. She got down in Fleet Street, went into the large office of a popular newspaper. At the desk she took an advertisement form, looked at the white sheet for a moment thoughtfully, and then wrote: "Secretary. Young lady from the colonies requires post as secretary. Resident secretary preferred. Small wages required. Shorthand and typewriting." She left a space for the box number, handed the advertisement across the counter, and paid the fee. She was back again in Lexington Street in time for tea, a meal which was brought up to her on a battered tray by her landlady. "Look here, Miss Drummond," said that worthy person, "I've got a few words to say to you." "Say them," said the girl carelessly. "I shall want your room after next week." Thalia turned slowly. "Does that mean I've got to get out?" "That's what it means. I can't have people like you staying in a respectable house. I'm surprised at you, a young lady as I always thought you were." "Continue to think so," said Thalia coolly. "I'm both young and ladylike." But the stout landlady was not to be checked in her well-rehearsed indictment. "A nice lady you are," she said, "giving my house a bad name. You've been in prison for a week. Perhaps you don't think I know, but I read the newspapers." "I'm sure you do," said the girl quietly. "That will do, Mrs. Bolett. I leave your house next week." "And I should like to say—" began the woman. "Say it on the mat," said Thalia, and closed the door in the choleric lady's face. As it was now growing dark, she lit a kerosene lamp and occupied the evening by manicuring her nails, an operation which was interrupted by the arrival of the 9 o'clock post. She heard the rat-tat at the door and the heavy feet of her landlady on the stairs. "A letter for you," called the woman. Thalia unlocked the door and took the envelope from the landlady's hand. "You'd better tell your friend that you're going to get a new address," said the woman, loath to leave her quarrel half finished. "I haven't told my friends yet that I live in such a horrible place," said Thalia sweetly, and locked the door before the woman could think of a suitable reply. She smiled as she carried the envelope to the light. It was addressed in printed characters. She turned it over, looking at the postmark before she opened it, and extracted a thick white card. At the first glance of the message her face changed its expression. The card was a square one, and in the centre was a large crimson circle. Within the circle was written in the same printed characters: "We have need of you. Enter the car which you will find waiting at the corner of Stane Square at 10 o'clock tomorrow night." She put the card down on the table and stared at it. The Crimson Circle had need of her. She had expected the summons, but it had come earlier than she had anticipated. Chapter 11. The Confession. At 3 minutes to 10 the following night, a closed car drove slowly into Stane Square and came to a halt at the corner of Clarges Street. A few minutes later Thalia Drummond walked into the square from the other end. She wore a long black cloak, and the little hat upon her head was held in its position by a thick veil knotted under her chin. Without a second's hesitation she opened the door of the car and stepped in. It was in complete darkness, but she could see the figure of the driver indistinctly. He did not turn his head, nor did he attempt to start the car, although she felt the vibration of the engines beneath her feet. "You were charged at the Marylebone Police Court yesterday morning with theft," said the driver without preamble. "Yesterday afternoon you inserted an advertisement describing yourself as a newly arrived colonial, your intention being to find another situation where you could continue your career of petty pilfering." "This is very interesting," said Thalia without a tremor of voice. "But you did not bring me here to give me my past history. When I had your letter I guessed that you thought I would be a very useful assistant. But there is one question I want to ask you." "If I wish to reply, I shall," was the uncompromising answer. "I realise that," said Thalia, with a faint smile in the darkness. "Suppose I had communicated with the police and had come here attended by Mr. Parr and the clever Mr. Derrick Yale?" "You would have been lying on the pavement dead by now," was the calm announcement. "Miss Drummond, I'm going to put easy money in your way and find you a very excellent job. I do not even mind if you indulge in your eccentricity in your spare time, but your principal task will be to serve me. You understand?" She nodded, and then realising he could not see her, she said, "Yes." "You will be paid well for everything you do. I shall always be on hand to help you, or to punish you if you attempt to betray me," he added. "Do you understand?" "Perfectly," she replied. "Your job will be a very simple one," went on the unknown driver. "You will present yourself at Brabazon's bank to-morrow. Brabazon is in need of a secretary." "But will he employ me?" she interrupted. "Must I go in another name?" "Go in your own name," said the man impatiently. "Don't interrupt. I will pay you £200 for your services. Here is the money." He thrust 2 notes over his shoulder, and she took them. Her hand accidentally touched his shoulder, and she felt something hard beneath his fleecy coat. "A bullet-proof waistcoat," she noted mentally, and then aloud, "What am I to say to Mr. Brabazon about my earlier experience?" "It will be unnecessary to say anything or do anything. You will receive your instructions from time to time. That is all," he added shortly. A few minutes later Thalia Drummond sat in the corner of the taxi cab which was taking her back to Lexington Street. Behind her, at intervals, came another taxi cab, which slowed when hers did, but never overtook her, not even when she descended at the corner of the street where her lodgings were situated. And when she turned the key of her street door, Inspector Parr was only a dozen paces from her. If she knew that she was being shadowed, she made no sign. Parr only waited for a few minutes, watching the house from the opposite side of the roadway, and then, as her light appeared in the upper window, he turned and walked thoughtfully back to the cab which had brought him so far eastward. He had opened the door of the cab and was stepping in, when somebody passed him on the sidewalk, somebody who was walking briskly with his collar turned up, but Inspector Parr knew him. "Flush!" he called sharply, and the man turned round on his heel. He was a little, dark, thin-faced, lithe man. At the sight of the inspector his jaw dropped. Why, Mr. Parr," he said with ill-affected geniality. "Who ever thought of seeing you in this part of the world?" "I want a little talk with you, Flush. Will you walk along with me?" It was an ominous invitation, which Mr. Flush had heard before. "You haven't got anything against me, Mr. Parr?" he said loudly. "Nothing," admitted Parr. "Besides, you're going straight now. I seem to remember you telling me that day you came out of prison." "That's right," said 'Flush' Barnet, heaving a sigh of relief. "Going straight, working for my living, and engaged to be married." "You don't tell me," said the stout Mr. Parr with simulated astonishment. "And is it Bella or Milly?" "It is Milly," said 'Flush'. inwardly cursing the excellent memory of the police inspector. "She's going straight too. She's got a job at one of the shops." "At Brabazon's bank, to be exact," said the inspector, and then turned as though some thought had arrested him. "I wonder," he muttered. "I wonder if that is it." "She's a perfect young lady, is Milly," Mr. 'Flush' hastened to explain. "Honest as the day, wouldn't swipe a clock, not if her life depended on it. I don't want you to think she's bad, Mr. Parr, because she's not. We're both living what I might term an honest life." Parr's placid face wrinkled in a smile. "That's grand news you're telling me, 'Flush'. Where is Milly to be found in these days?" "She's living in diggings on the other side of the river," said 'Flush' reluctantly. "You're not going to rake up old scandals, are you, Mr. Parr?" "Heaven forbid," said Inspector Parr piously. "No, I'd like to have a talk with her. Perhaps—" he hesitated. "Anyway, it can wait. It was rather providential meeting you, 'Flush'." But 'Flush' did not share that view, even though he expressed a faint acquiescence. "So that's it," said Inspector Parr to himself, but he did not express the nature of his suspicions, even when he met Derrick Yale at his club half an hour later. And it was a further curious fact that, though they touched every aspect of the Crimson Circle mystery in the long conversation which followed, never once did Mr. Parr mention Thalia Drummond's interview, which, if he had not seen, he had at least guessed. The two men left early the next morning for the little country town where one Ambrose Sibley, described as an able seaman, was held on a charge of murder. At his own earnest request, Jack Beardmore was allowed to accompany them, though he was not present at the interview between the two detectives and the sullen man who had slain his father. A brawny, unshaven fellow, half Scottish, half Swede, Sibley proved to be. He could neither read nor write, and had been in the hands of the police before. This much Parr had discovered from a reference of his finger prints. At first he was not inclined to commit himself, and it was rather Derrick Yale's skilful cross-examination than Inspector Parr's efforts which produced the confession. "Yes, I did it all right," he said at last. They were seated in the cell, with an official shorthand writer taking a note of his statement. "You've got me proper, but you wouldn't have got me if I hadn't been drunk. And whilst I'm confessing, I might as well own up that I killed Harry Hobbs. He was a shipmate of mine on the Oritianga in 1912. They can only hang me once. Killed him and chucked his body overboard, I did, over the question of a woman that we met at Newport News, which is in America. I'll tell you how this happened, gentlemen. I lost my ship about a month ago and was stranded at the Sailors' Home at Wapping. I got chucked out of there for being drunk, and on top of that, I was locked up and got 7 days imprisonment. If the old fool had only given me a month, I shouldn't have been here. One night after I came out of prison, I was walking through the East End, down on my luck and starving for a drink, and feeling properly miserable. To make it worse, I had the toothache." Parr met Derrick Yale's eyes, and Derrick smiled faintly. "I was loafing along the edge of the pavement looking for cigarette ends, and thinking of nothing except where I could get a bit of food and a night's lodging. It was beginning to rain too, and it looked as though I was going to have another night on the streets, when I heard a voice say almost in my ear, 'Jump in.' I looked round. A motor car was standing by the side of the roadway. I couldn't believe my ears. Presently the man in the car said, 'Jump in, it's you I mean,' and he mentioned my name. We drove along for a while without his saying anything, and I noticed that he kept clear of all the streets where the big lights were. After a bit he stopped the car and began to tell me who I was. I can assure you I was surprised. He knew the whole of my history, he even knew about Harry Hobbs. I was tried for that killing and acquitted. And then he asked me if I'd like to earn £100. I told him I would, and he said there was an old gentleman in the country who had done him a lot of harm, and he wanted him outed. I didn't want to take the job on for some time, but he gave me such a lot of talk about how he could get me hung for Hobbs' murder, and how it was safe, and he'd give me a bicycle to get away on, and at last I agreed. He picked me up by arrangement a week later in Staines Square. Then he gave me all the final particulars. I got down to Beardmore's place soon after it was dark and hid in the wood. He told me Mr. Beardmore generally walked through the wood every morning, and that I was to make myself comfortable for the night. I hadn't been in the wood an hour when I had a fright. I heard somebody moving. I think it must have been a gamekeeper. He was a big fellow, and I only just got a glimpse of him. I think that's about all, gentlemen, except that the next morning the old fellow came in the wood and I shot him. I don't remember much about it, for I was drunk at the time, having taken a bottle of whisky into the wood with me, but I was sober enough to get on to the bicycle and I rode off. And I should have got away altogether if it hadn't been for the booze. "And that is all?" asked Parr, when the confession had been read over and the man had affixed a rough cross. "That's all, Governor," said the sailor. "And you don't know who it was who employed you?" "Not the faintest idea," said the other cheerfully. "There's one thing about him, though, I could tell you," he said after a pause. "He kept using a word that I've never heard before. I'm not highly educated, but I've noticed that some men have favourite words. We had an old skipper who always used the word morbid." "What was the word?" asked Parr. The man scratched his head. "I'll remember it and let you know," he said, and they left him to his meditations, which were few and probably not unpleasant. 4 hours after, the gaoler took Ambrose Sibley some food. He was lying on his bed and the gaoler shook him by the shoulder. "Wake up," he said. But Ambrose Sibley never woke again. He was stone dead, and in the tin dipper half filled with water which stood by his bed and with which he had slaked his thirst, they found sufficient hydrocyanic acid to kill 50 men. But it was not the poison which interested Inspector Parr so much as the little circle of crimson paper which was found floating on the top of the water. End of section 4. Section 5 of The Crimson Circle by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 12. The Pointed Boots. Mr. Felix Marl sat behind the locked door of his bedroom, and he was engaged in a task which had the element of unpleasant familiarity. 25 years before, when he was an inmate of the big French prison at Toulouse, he had worked in a bootmaker's shop, and the handling of boots was an everyday experience. It is true his business had been to repair and not to destroy. Today, with a razor-sharp knife, he was cutting to shreds a pair of pointed, patent leather shoes which he had only worn 3 times. Strip by strip he cut the leather, which he then placed on the fire. Some men live intensely and suffer intensely. Mr. Felix Marl was one of those who could crowd into a day the terrors of an aeon. In some manner a newspaper had got hold of the story of the footprint in Beardmore's ground, and a new fear had been added to the many which confused and paralysed this big man. He was sitting in his shirt sleeves, the perspiration rolling down his face, for the fire was a big one and the room was superheated. Presently the last shred was thrown into the fire, and he sat watching it grill and flame before he put away the knife, washed his hands, and opened the windows to let out the acrid odour of burning leather. It would have been better, he thought, if he had carried out his first resolution, and he cursed himself for the cowardice which had induced him to substitute his revolver for a fountain pen. But he was safe. Nobody had seen him leave the grounds. With such men as he, blind panic and unreasoning confidence succeed one another, almost as a natural reaction. By the time he had descended his stairs to his little library, he had almost forgotten that he was in any danger. In the fading light of day he had written a conciliatory, even a grovelling letter, and had, as he believed, delivered it safely. Would it be found? He had another moment of panic. "Pshaw!" said Mr. Marl, and dismissed that dangerous possibility. His servant brought him a tea tray and arranged it on a small table by the side of his desk where the big man sat. "Will you see that gentleman now, sir?" "Eh?" said Mr. Marl, turning round. "Which gentleman?" "I told you there was a man who wanted to see you." Marl remembered that his boot-destroying operation had been interrupted by a knock. "Who is he?" he asked. "I put his card on the table, sir." "Didn't you tell him that I was engaged?" "Yes, but he said he'd wait until you came down." The man handed him the card, and Mr. Marl, reading it, jumped and turned a sickly yellow. "Inspector Parr," he said unsteadily. "What does he want with me?" His shaking hand fingered his mouth. "Show him in," he said with an effort. He had not met Inspector Parr either professionally or socially, and his first glance at the little man reassured him. There was nothing particularly menacing in the appearance of the red-faced detective. "Sit down, Inspector. I'm sorry I was busy when you came," said Mr. Marl. When he was agitated, his voice was almost bird-like in its thinness. Parr sat down on the edge of the nearest chair, balancing his derby hat on his knee. "I thought I'd wait until you came down, Mr. Marl. I wanted to see you about this Beardmore murder." Mr. Marl said nothing. With an effort he kept his trembling lips from quivering, and assumed, as he believed, an air of polite interest. "You knew Mr. Beardmore very well?" "Not very well," said Marl. "I certainly have had business dealings with him." "Have you met him before?" Marl hesitated. He was the kind of man to whom a lie came most readily, and his natural habit of mind was to state the exact opposite of the truth. "No," he admitted. "I'd seen him years ago, but that was before he'd grown a beard." "Where was Mr. Beardmore when you were coming into the house?" asked Parr. "He was standing on the terrace," replied Marl with unnecessary loudness. "And you saw him?" Marl nodded. "They tell me, Mr. Marl," Parr went on, looking down at his hat, "that for some reason or other you were startled. Mr. Jack Beardmore says that he thought you were momentarily terrified. What was the cause of that?" Mr. Marl shrugged his shoulders and forced a smile. "I think I explained it was a little heart attack. I'm subject to them," he said. Parr had turned his hat so that he was looking into the interior, and he did not raise his eyes when he asked, "It was not the sight of Mr. Beardmore?" "Of course not," said the other vigorously. "Why should I be scared of Mr. Beardmore? I've had a lot of correspondence with him, and know him almost as well." "But you hadn't met him for years." "I hadn't seen him for years," corrected Marl irritably. "And the cause of your agitation was just a heart attack, Mr. Marl?" asked the inspector. For the first time his eyes rose and fixed themselves upon the other's. "Absolutely." Marl's voice did not lack heartiness. "I'd forgotten all about my little seizure until you reminded me." "There's another point I wanted cleared up," said the detective. His attention had gone back to his fascinating hat, which he was turning over and over mechanically until it had the appearance of a revolving butter churn. "When you came to Mr. Beardmore's house, you were wearing pointed patent shoes." Marl frowned. "Was I? I've forgotten." "Did you take any walk into the grounds, except the walk you had from the railway station?" "No." "You didn't walk around the house to admire the architecture?" "No, I did not. I was only in the house a few minutes, and then I drove away." Mr. Parr raised his eyes to the ceiling. "Would it be asking you too much," he demanded apologetically, "if I requested you to show me the patent shoes you wore that day?" "Certainly," said Marl, rising with alacrity. He was out of the room a few minutes, and came back with a pair of long, pointed patent boots. The detective took them in his hand and looked earnestly at the sole. "Yes," he said. "Of course, these are not the boots you were wearing, because—" he rubbed the soles gently with his hand. "There's dust on them, and the ground has been wet for the last week." Marl's heart nearly stopped beating. "Those are the boots I wore," he said defiantly. "What you call dust is really dried mud." Parr looked at his dusty fingers and shook his head. "I think there must be some mistake, Mr. Marl," he said gently. "This is chalk dust." He put the boots down and rose. "However, it isn't very important," he said. He stood so long, looking down at the carpet, that Mr. Marl, in spite of his fear, became impatient. "Is there anything more I can do for you, officer?" he asked. "Yes," said Parr. "I want you to give me the name and address of your tailor. Perhaps you would write it down for me." "My tailor?" Mr. Marl glared at the visitor. "What the dickens do you want of my tailor?" And then, with a laugh, "Well, you're a curious man, inspector, but I'll do it with pleasure." He went to his secrétaire, pulled out a sheet of paper, wrote down a name and address, and, blotting it, handed it to the detective. "Thank you, sir." Parr did not even look at the address, but put the paper into his pocket. "I'm sorry to bother you, but you will realise that everybody who was present at the house within 24 hours of Mr. Beardmore's death must necessarily be interrogated. The Crimson Circle—" "The Crimson Circle!" gasped Mr. Marl, and the detective looked at him straightly. "Didn't you know that the Crimson Circle were responsible for this murder?" To do him justice, Mr. Felix Marl knew nothing of the kind. He had seen a brief report that James Beardmore had been found shot, but the association of the murder with the Crimson Circle had not been disclosed except by the Monitor, a newspaper which Mr. Marl never read. He dropped into a chair, quaking. "The Crimson Circle," he muttered. "Good God, I never thought—" He checked himself. "What didn't you think?" asked Parr gently. "The Crimson Circle," murmured the big man again. "I thought it was just—" He did not complete his sentence. For an hour after the detective's departure, Felix Marl sat huddled up in his chair, his head in his hands. The Crimson Circle! It was the first time he had ever been brought into even the remotest touch with that blackmailing organisation, and now its obtrusion upon the order of his thoughts was so violent that it disturbed every theory he had formed. "I don't like it," he muttered as he got up painfully and turned on the light in the darkened room. "I think this is where I get away." He spent the evening examining his bank book, and the examination was very comforting. He could squeeze out a little more, he thought, and then— Chapter 13 Mr. Marl Squeezes a Little More. Another agent of the Crimson Circle found her lines cast in pleasant places. She had been accepted by Mr. Brabazon without question, and evidently the man in the car possessed extraordinary influences. What was even more extraordinary was that day followed day without a word from her mysterious employer. She had expected that he would almost immediately avail himself of her services, but she had been at Brabazon's late Sellers bank nearly a month before she received any communication. It came one morning. She found the letter on her desk addressed in bold pen print. There was no sign of the Circle on the letter, which began without preamble: "Make the acquaintance of Marl. Discover why he has a hold over Brabazon. Send me the figures of his account, and notify me immediately his account is closed. Notify me also if Parr and Derrick Yale come to the bank. Wire Johnson, 23 Mildred Street, City." She carried out her instructions faithfully, though it was not for a few days that she had an opportunity of seeing Mr. Marl. Only once did Derrick Yale come into the bank. She had seen him before, when he was a guest at the Beardmores', and even if she had not, she would have recognised him from the portrait of the famous detective which had appeared in the newspapers. What his business was she did not learn, but looking out of the corner of her eye from the little office she occupied alone, by virtue of her position as Brabazon's private secretary,
She saw him talking with one of the tellers at the counter, and duly notified the Crimson Circle. Inspector Parr, however, did not come, nor did she see Jack Beardmore. She did not want to think too much of Jack. He was not a pleasant subject. In moments of perturbation, John Brabazon, the austere and stately president of Sellers Bank, had a characteristic little trick. His white hands would stray to the hair, curly and thick at the back of his head. One curl he would twist about his forefinger for a moment, and then he would slowly bring the tips of his fingers across his bald dome until they rested on his forehead. In such moments, with his head bowed and his fingers resting on his brow, he had the appearance of being engaged in prayer. The gentleman who sat with him in his neat office had no characteristics at all. He was a big man who breathed noisily, and he was puffy with lazy, indulgent living, but he did not fidget, and his hands were folded over his large waistcoat. "My dear Marl," the banker's voice was soft and almost caressing, "you try my patience at times. I will say nothing about the strain you put upon my resources." The big man chuckled. "I give you security, Brab. Excellent security, old man. You can't deny that." Mr. Brabazon's white fingers played a tune on the edge of his desk. "You bring me impossible schemes, and hitherto I've been foolish enough to finance them," he said. "There must come an end to such folly. You have no need for help. Your balance at this bank alone is nearly 100,000." Marl looked round at the door and bent forward. "I'll tell you a story," he mumbled. "A story about a penniless young clerk that married the widow of Seller, of Seller's Bank. She was old enough to be his mother, and died suddenly, in Switzerland. She fell over a precipice. Don't I know it? Wasn't I taking photographs of the beautiful mountain scenery? Did I ever show you the picture of that accident, Brab? You are in it. Yes, you're in it, though you told the examining magistrate you were miles and miles away." Mr. Brabazon's eyes were on the desk. Not a muscle of his face moved. "Besides," said Mr. Marl in a more normal tone, "you can afford it. You're making another matrimonial alliance. That's the expression, ain't it?" The banker raised his eyes and frowned at his visitor. "What do you mean?" he demanded. Mr. Marl was evidently amused. He slapped his knee and choked with laughter. "What about the person you met in Steyne Square the other night? The one in the closed motor car, eh? Don't deny it, I saw you. A nice little car it was." Now, for the first time, Brabazon displayed signs of emotion. His face was grey and drawn, and his eyes seemed to have receded further into their sockets. "I will arrange your loan," he said. Mr. Marl's expression of satisfaction was interrupted by a knock at the door. At Brabazon's "Come in," the door opened to admit one whose appearance put all other matters out of the visitor's head. The girl brought a paper which she placed before her employer, evidently a pencilled telephone message. White, gold, red. Mr. Marl's senses registered the impression he received. White, creamy white and delicate skin, red as poppies the scarlet lips, yellow as ripe corn the hair. He saw her in profile, was revolted a little at the firmness of her chin. Mr. Marl liked women who were yielding and soft and malleable in his hands, but the beauty of mouth and nose and brow, they made him blink. He breathed a little more quickly, a little more loudly, and when she'd gone, after a colloquy in a low tone, he sighed. "What a queen," he said. "I've seen her somewhere before. What is her name?" "Drummond. Thalia Drummond," said Mr. Brabazon, eyeing the gross man coldly. "Thalia Drummond," repeated Felix slowly. "Isn't she the girl who used to be with Froyant? Bit sweet on her yourself, eh, Brabazon?" The man at the writing table looked at the other steadily. "I do not make it a practice to be sweet on my employees, Mr. Marl," he said. "Miss Drummond is a very efficient worker. That is all that I require of my staff." Marl rose heavily, chuckling. "I'll see you to morrow morning about that other business," he said. He laughed wheezily, but Mr. Brabazon did not smile. "At 10:30 to morrow," he said, going to the door with the visitor. "Or can you make it 11?" "11," agreed the man. "Good morning," said the banker, but did not offer his hand. Hardly had the door closed on the visitor before Mr. Brabazon locked it and returned to his desk. He took from his pocket book a plain white card and, dipping his pen in the red ink, drew a small circle. Beneath he wrote the words: "Felix Marl saw our interview in Steyne Square. He lives at 79 Marisburg Place." He put the card into an envelope and addressed it: "Mr. Johnson, 23 Mildred Street, City." End of section 5.